Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. And thank you so much, Chris and Camilla, for inviting me. You may or may not know, but the Radical Anthropology group is actually quite famous around the world. So it is a professional and life level unlocked to be invited to give a talk here. So thank you so much. The pleasure is all mine. There are not very many of us, shockingly, who have 1 foot in evolutionary anthropology and 1 foot in sociocultural anthropology. And it is oftentimes a lonesome place to be, except in communities like this one, where the fact that you use these different lenses is something that is celebrated as opposed to questioned. So I'm very delighted to speak with you tonight. Despite my very best efforts to be so technologically advanced, and double and triple check my talk, I have some photos for you that unfortunately didn't make it over through the transfer on my USB drive. So at the end of the talk, I'm going to finish up a little sooner than I had anticipated so that we have more time for questions. And I'll be telling you about my most recent research as opposed to showing you some photographs. But if there's time, I have a few pulled up from the internet that we might be able to talk about that I can pull up manually. I'll be talking tonight, the title of my talk is Continuity and Change Among a Community of East African Hunter-Gatherers, and I'll be talking about some recent work that I've done over the past few years with members of the Hadza community of foragers who live in northern Tanzania. Just a quick outline of my talk, and I want to make sure that I stay on task so that we have time to chat after I'm done presenting my lecture. I'll introduce the population whom I work with. I'll talk a little bit about some population characteristics, and I'll talk a very brief overview of diet composition. And then I'll move into some ecological and nutritional changes that the community is currently facing, and move into 3 projects that I've selected that document the changing environment that the Hadza are currently occupying. Oral health, EPDS, so postpartum depression, and infant health and changes in juvenile foraging behavior. I'll also move into my current and future research, which fortunately I'll do by interpretive dance and discussion because the photos didn't make it, but we can talk about that. Some of my work that I'm starting that I just came back from the field about a month ago, where I started a project on food and water insecurity, impact of climate change, and some efforts on community capacity building that we can get into. So I'll first introduce the Hadza. I first went to the field as a graduate student doing my pilot study in the summer of 2004. And if I'm not mistaken, Camilla was actually out there working with a lot of the women who I'll be mentioning today at that time. So that was my first field season, and I've been going back continually since 2004. You can see, I don't have a clicker with me, but you can see the pop out of Tanzania, and then you can see the pop out of the research region here. And essentially here in northern Tanzania is Lake Eyasi. And if you pop this out, this is Lake Eyasi, this is the Yaida Valley. So most of my research has been conducted over the past decade on the east side of the lake here. There are Hadza who reside to the west side of the lake, but for reasons we can talk about at the end, they are not foraging as frequently, and they're dealing with a shifting political and ecological landscape on the west side of Lake Eyasi that is actually quite different than that on the east side, and so they have not worked with researchers as frequently. There are about 1,000 individuals who self-identify as Hadza, and typically, historically, this identification process happened by language. So the Hadza refer to themselves as the Hadzabe peoples, and their language is Hadzane. It's a click-based language. And typically this was an in-group, out-group marker. So individuals who could speak Hadzane were self-identified as Hadza. Increasingly, however, they've moved to other types of identity classifications, as many of the children, particularly on the west side of the lake, do not speak Hadzane. So there are about 1,000 individuals. The population has stayed relatively stable, at least for the last 100 years, since the turn of the last century, roughly, when we started doing our first population counts. And of that 1,000, there's approximately 150 or 200 individuals who are still foraging for at least a significant portion of their daily diet. So that means that they are hunting and gathering, they are targeting wild game animals typical of the East African savanna, and also targeting plant foods. And we'll talk a little bit about those foods as we move forward today. This is quite romantic, and we'll talk about the romanticization of foragers at the end. But I do love this photograph, and I do love the statement. It is from a documentary on the Hadza called The Hadza Last of the First. And it says, just south of the equator, between the Soda waters of Tanzania's Lake Eyasi and the ramparts of the Great Rift Valley, lived the Hadza, a small tribe of approximately 1,000 hunter-gatherers, one of the last in Africa. And this is a beautiful picture that was taken. You can see the Rift Valley, you can see the rift walls there in the distance. And this is really close to Lake Eyasi, which is an alkaline lake. And this particular area is considered to be a hotbed of human evolution. So it is just south of the Serengeti, just south of the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. So if anyone has heard of the Serengeti Plateau, this is directly south of that area. It is also quite near to Olduvai Gorge, where some of the most significant fossil finds in human evolution have been found. The Hadza are often considered to be kind of the poster foraging population for human evolutionary anthropology. The reasons being, there are a couple of reasons. One, location, 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 right? So geography, in terms of where this particular ecosystem lies, in terms of being so close to Olduvai Gorge. Another reason is that the Hadza are one of the last foraging populations on the continent of Africa. Many paleoclimatologists believe that the area in which the Hadza reside and the foods that they target are similar to the foods that our ancestors targeted, which is one of the reasons why there have been so many studies on Hadza foraging and lifeway, simply because it has been thought for many years that this is kind of a window into our evolutionary past, where for 95% of human evolutionary history, we were hunters and gatherers. So this is one of the reasons that the Hadza are incredibly popular. And their popularity is only gaining, as we will see momentarily, as access to them becomes easier and easier. So in terms of diet composition, which is one of kind of the pillars of my research, as of 2005, so roughly around the time when I started collecting my data and doing my research in the community, the Hadza diet was composed of approximately 97% wild foods. So this meant that roughly only 3% of domesticated cultigens were coming into the community, whether this is by trade or purchase or donation. It was highly seasonal, which meant that the rainy season diet and the dry season diet were very different. So people were targeting different foods depending on the amount of rainfall, which makes sense if you're a forager, right? So every day is hitched on getting enough food to feed you and your family. As of 2012, my colleagues and I collected gut microbiome data and were able to analyze the composition of the diet based on the end point of digestion, where we collected and analyzed the contents of fecal samples. And the gut microbiome reflected a wild diet, a predominantly wild food diet for those individuals who were residing in bush camps. As of 2015, I employed a new method, one that was much easier in terms of time and much less onerous for the Hadza, and it allowed us to collect data all around the territory where the Hadza live, both in the bush camps and in camps that are located more closely, they're more closely situated to urban centers or to villages. And in 2015, 24-hour dietary recall data suggested that the Hadza, even in the deepest bush camps, were eating a diet that was mixed. So it had wild foods and domesticated cultigens. And just some pictures here to take you through some of the typical Hadza foods. Up here on the upper left, you see a Hadza woman using a digging stick, and she's digging for a tuber, which is an underground storage organ, a root vegetable, somewhat like a potato, although nutritionally quite different, much more fibrous, much more difficult to digest. Sometimes they can be 2 to 3 feet underground. Oftentimes this is a rainy season photo, as you can see illustrated with the green foliage, but in the dry season, sometimes you can go 3 feet down in hard-packed soil in order to access those tubers. So they're quite difficult to get. They are available year-round historically. This is not so much the case now, but we'll get into that. Here on the lower left, I don't have a picture of the animal yet. We do have some photos later on, if hopefully that photo survived. If not, then just imagine what this hunter is hunting. Imagine that he is targeting a zebra or a greater kudu. On the upper right, that is a beehive. If you're not aware of what you are seeing, that is a wild beehive, the African killer bee. This hive is located in a baobab tree. This is about 25 feet up in the air. And this man is smoking the hive, which essentially acts to pacify the bees. The bees then panic that their hive is on fire and will pack these little saddlebags on the sides of their body with liquid honey. They will vacate the hive, and they're somewhat lethargic as they're packed with all of their worldly belongings, right, their treasures. They will exit the hive, which means that they're less likely to sting the honey hunter. So this is quite a risky business, targeting honey of this nature, but that is a beautiful example of what Hadza wild honey looks like. This is now also often collected and traded in the village for other types of goods or services as needed. And on the bottom right, you see a woman who is pounding baobab fruit. So you too can eat like a hunter-gatherer. Most natural food markets, including right here in London, will carry baobab products. So baobab fruit chews, baobab superfruit chews, vitamin supplements. Oftentimes it actually even says things like eat like a hunter-gatherer, or it will say things like baobab, the new superfruit. So if you're interested, it's often coupled with other types of sweeter fruits because baobab happens to be quite tart, and put together in these supplements. Just as an aside, just as a note, right now it is impossible to harvest baobab fruit sustainably. It's all wild fruit. There are no cultivars, there are no crops of baobab. So once this resource is tapped, that's it. So you too can eat like a hunter-gatherer. You are also eating food that may soon no longer be around. So in terms of annual diet composition, this is a snapshot of some work that is currently in preparation where it's a very large data set. It's been a very daunting project. You would not believe how much work went into one little pie chart for you. But this is 10 years of dietary data. So essentially what this means is myself or my research assistants, and before my time, so remember I got there in 2004, so I only did 1 year of this decade-long project. We weighed every single thing that was coming back into camp over a collective, I think it's about 17 months of data collection spanning the entire year, so rainy season and dry season. Everything that was brought back to camp was weighed. And then rather than being kilograms, these are actually the kilocalorie estimates. So it then took a very long time because all of these wild foods had to then be analyzed, and I analyzed them myself. I never thought when I got into graduate school that I would have to become a nutritional chemist. So life is surprising. I learned how to do nutritional chemistry in order to figure out how we could get the energy content. So essentially, if you look at the back of a granola bar or something, and you look at all of the energy content that it lists for your food, that's essentially what we did for Hadza foods, and then we were able to pull out the energy content, the calories. So this essentially is what the diet looks like, and you'll see the 3% domesticated grains up there on the top. I'm working right now on the equivalent for right now, essentially for 2018, 2019. I don't have it yet, but I can tell you, spoiler alert, it does not look like this. We're missing we're missing a few of the actual slices, and some are much smaller. Tubers is much smaller, large game is much smaller, baobab fruit is much smaller, domesticated grains is much greater, figs, nuts, and legumes are almost completely gone. Berries is about the same, and honey and larva has expanded. You can also see some seasonal variation. This was taken out of a paper done by my colleagues in 2009, where you can see kind of a seasonal variation taken during the same time period, and this is just kilogram wet weight of the food back. So it's a snapshot. It's not as accurate as calories, but it's a very good snapshot. I have this here. Oh, and I forgot. I was so focused on my photos, I forgot sound. Let's see if this will work. Let's see. You can just watch. There's no sound.
Well,
Let's see.
can you turn it up at the end?
Yeah,
Let's see.
if you turn up with one,
It's 100%.
so you should know. You're on the 100%.
Yeah, let's try see. Let's try it. Technology is failing me today. It's maxed. So if we're very quiet, we can hear. Okay, you get the idea. So you don't actually need the audio. It's for you to see what the tubers look like and the foraging activities. I show this clip from 1966 for a reason. When I was there in 2005, almost the exact same thing happened in 2005 when I was on the tuber dig. Almost the exact same thing happened in 2015. So these behaviors have stayed relatively consistent from 1966 when James Woodburn first documented them on film. If you haven't seen this film called the Hadza, I encourage you to do so. It's really fantastic, and so much of those activities are persisting. This now, in 2019, when women have access to tubers, the process is quite similar. The trick is there aren't as many tubers available. So I use this clip to show, so when I talk about continuity and change, this is part of the continuity. The foraging behaviors are still the same. Access to the resources available are different. This was a photo taken in 2017 by one of my graduate students, Crittenden. And I show this photo because this was a Hadza bush camp, and during this time, when she was working in this camp, these are large bags of, these look like beans, but there were drops of, that looks like maize, there were drops of maize and beans happening every few weeks throughout the year. And this missionary presence is sporadic, but often government aid agencies will take the place of missionary groups. So if missionary groups are not doing food drops, then government aid agencies will come in to do so. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit now. I'm going to show you some pictures on kind of the shifting ecological and nutritional landscape that the Hadza are now residing in. So I first want to start by talking about the myth of the uncontacted forager. So I always do this with my students back home at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And when I teach my courses, either on nutritional anthropology or on hunters and gatherers, or even in intro to biological anthropology or intro to cultural anthropology, I often tell them that one of the most important things that I can teach them is how to be a critical reader. Teaching critical thinking is a lot harder, but teaching critical reading is much easier, and I feel much more confident that they can leave my course with those skills. For example, how many of you, excuse me, have read anything recently about an uncontacted tribe somewhere in the world? Okay, raise them higher so everybody can see. Okay, great. And I urge you to go back to those articles about those uncontacted tribes, and this is what I have my students do, and read them very carefully. What you will often find is a little sentence or two in that piece about how, well, loggers have always known this community is there. Well, the government has chosen to leave them alone for X, Y, or Z reason. Well, the tourists go, of course, but they remain uncontacted. Okay? So if government officials, loggers, and tourists know how to get to a community, they are not uncontacted. That is for our benefit. That is for the benefit of the reader of that newspaper article, right? That is for the benefit of the person reading National Geographic. Right? We're listening to a BBC story. BBC is right here. Right here. I want to make sure my leash allows me to get over here. Okay. So Rewild Your Gut, the Hadza experiments with Tim Spector. So you can Google that. Here you can see on the upper right, there was a GoFundMe site. This was actually one of the missionary groups that was providing a lot of the food drop-offs several years ago. They were in trouble for, I guess, tax evasion. So they're no longer doing drop-offs, but other groups have stepped up to do the job. So the Hadza were first, we think, the first recorded contact, although they claim that it was much earlier, was in 1910 by Otto Demwolf. Then you had Obst in 1912, Bogshaw with a series of studies in the early 1920s, Dorothea Bleek in 1930, Cooper 1940s, Woodburn 1958. Blurton, Jones, Hawks, and O'Connell from the U.S. in the 1980s, Schoeniger and Bunn also from the U.S. late 1990s, and Frank Marlowe, my former advisor from the mid-1990s to 2012. Frank had 4 graduate students. All of those 4 graduate students, myself included, now have graduate students. So you can see there's been an almost continual presence in Hadza land since the turn of the last century. And as of 2019, there are 6 international teams of researchers working with the same largely 200 people, give or take, depending on if you work in the village or not, anywhere from 200 to 1,000 individuals. There's at least 3 missionary groups. Over the summer, I documented how many had been coming up to the highlands over the last year, dozens of tour operators, and dozens of film and TV crews annually. There has also been a very popularized story. Some say it's an urban legend, that it's a myth, and some say it absolutely occurred. I will leave it to you to determine which source you trust. But you will see there in science, there was a story about a scientist who gave themselves a fecal transplant to try a hunter-gatherer's microbiome. There are some very colorful blog posts about this. I encourage you to check it out. There is a trend to rewilding everything and using the Hadza as the model in order to rewild whatever it is about yourself that you are trying to rewild. So we'll get into that. So needless to say, the Hadza are far from uncontacted, and in fact, they're media darlings. When I first started in 2004, the tourist industry had not really taken off. I don't know if this was Camilla's experience as well, but it wasn't that easy to find popular information on the Hadza. There was a little bit of stuff here and there, but really not a lot. I remember one of my great uncles thought I was really insane, and he didn't understand why I was leaving to get on a plane to go live with the community so far away. And he tried to find information on the Hadza, couldn't find anything on the internet. Went to the local library in Mountain View, California, and ordered some books from Interlibrary Loan, ordered some of James Woodburn's work from Interlibrary Loan, and versed himself on the Hadza before I got on the plane. It was very challenging to find information. It wasn't at your fingertips. Last night, I looked, and if you put in Hadza, you get 500,000 hits. You put in Hadzabe people, I think it was 140,000, give or take. You put in Hadza hunter-gatherer, you get another couple 100,000. The point is now, images, video clips, stories, blog posts abound, which is a blessing and a curse for the community, right? So, if you are interested in a very easy to read, very accessible snapshot of current political and ecological challenges facing the community, I urge you to read Ann Gibbons' piece that came out in Science a couple years ago called Hadza on the Brink, Farmers, Tourists, and Cattle Threaten Some of the World's Last Hunter-Gatherers, long a magnet for researchers. It's a very interesting read. You can get some information there. Also, the documentary I mentioned, The Hadza Last Survivors, tells a fairly accurate portrayal of the current situation facing the Hadza. But I encourage you to be critical readers and critical viewers and critical consumers of social media content. Because now you all know how truly contacted the Hadza are and will continue to be. And along with all of this media exposure, there are some good things that come along with it that are beneficial to the community, and there are also some things that are less so, that are questionably less so. I give an example of the human food bar, which I have been told by some of my graduate students has been taken off the market, but it was on up until last year. Nutrition from the inside out, you're 99% microbe, it's time you start eating like it. No artificial preservatives or freaky stuff of any kind. You heard us. Prebiotic fiber, gluten-free, grain-free, Hadza food, science. I don't know how they got science into a nutrition bar, but that is an awesome ingredient, I will say that. This is my friend Paolo. He's non-literate. So Paolo reading the ingredients on the back of the food bar ostensibly. But this was the advertisement for this human food bar. And I show this only because I think that we far too often are so interested in turning to indigenous foraging communities as a model of our ancestral past that we fail to appreciate how damaging that can be to the communities in the present. So there are so many relevant and interesting evolutionary questions that we can ask of these communities. And there are also many questions that are perhaps less scientifically relevant now in 2019. And you can be the critical viewers and consumers of information to make the decision. I'm also going to go over some land cover change. This image was given to me by Carbon Tanzania, which is a nonprofit based in the US but operating in Tanzania. And the only thing that's really important for you to pay attention to are the colors. Let's see how far I'm allowed to get. I'm going to take it with me. Okay, great. So, upper left you have 2000 all the way to 2015, and you'll see that it's mostly primarily green with a little bit of red, right? So the little bit of red is the conversion to agriculture. There's not a lot of yellow up there is what you'll see. In 2000 to 2005, you see more red, but also you see a lot of yellow, which the yellow is established agriculture now. So this is established small-scale horticultural plots and farming. From 2005 to 2010, you'll see less conversion and more actual established agriculture. And then from 2010 to 2015, we don't have the data yet for 2015 to 2020, but Carbon Tanzania has promised to provide them to me when they're available. What you see is more conversion, and what they have told me is that what we will see in the 2015 to 2020 graph is that everything that is red here that is conversion to agriculture will be yellow in the coming 5-year increment, and this will all be agriculture, and then you will see conversion of agriculture here. And if you're wondering where the Hadza reside, historically it was everywhere here. Now it's here, including here, right here. So this line would all be Hadza territory. The green line, what is covered in green, is the land, the hectares of land that were given to the Hadza as their traditional hunting ground. It's a lot of agriculture and conversion to agriculture on acacia comifera woodland, much of which has been deemed ancestral Hadza territory. So as you can see, boundaries have proven unenforceable for a lot of this. And this does not actually show any presence of pastoral populations, which is much higher than even agriculture in the area where the Hadza are still foraging. Maize has entered the community with a bang. I love this picture on the far right. So you don't need to rely on my photos. Use Google, one of those hundreds of thousands of Hadza images that you will find on the internet with tourism now. And what you're seeing over there is a clutch of Hadza arrows. What you see on the end, a corn cob. So there are now corn cob arrowheads. These are for particular types of birds, and sometimes they're burned, corn cobs roasted, because the Hadza will make popcorn. They'll roast it on the corn cob and eat it off the cob. And sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's been whole. They're using them either to protect the arrows, sometimes if there's poison, or just they'll use the actual corn cob as an arrowhead for certain types of bird species. So even in bush camps, you have the products of domesticated foods being used in other ways, in addition to food. There's the full picture of the Hadza beehive that you saw earlier. It might be more easy to determine what it is now. Wild honey is a very popular food. It's actually the most highly ranked Hadza food by men, women, and children alike. Far more important than meat. Honey is the most highly prized food source. As a nutritional anthropologist, this makes a lot of sense to me because it's packed with glucose, and of course the brain is an obligate glucose consumer. So we need honey or something like honey, in order to build this big brain, right, in utero, in order to grow and maintain this large machine that makes it all work, right? And we think that we have a very long evolutionary relationship with honey. So honey is a very important food to the community, but it is highly tethered to rainfall patterns. So during drought years, when there's very low rainfall, it's a problem. We had one of these years just recently in 2017, and the minister ordered 100 beehives annually for the Hadza community, and this is the 3rd or 4th attempt for the Hadza to keep fixed beehives. It hasn't worked so far. They tried in the 50s, they tried again around the 70s or 80s, but perhaps this time it will work. And the honey can be used, as I said, as a currency for goods and services in town. So the diet is rapidly shifting away from wild foods. And my research, because it bridges biological and cultural questions, I'm really interested in how this is impacting foraging behavior, health outcomes, and reproduction. For most of my career, I've worked with women and their children. So what this means is that plant foods have been what I largely focus all of my research on, because I work with women and children, and women target plant foods typically. So I think, for me, this could explain why I'm one of the only researchers of the moment who is actually looking at ecological and nutritional change. It's something that my friends, my interlocutors are talking about all the time. And as a person who studies diet composition as my foundation, it's impossible to look away from the dietary changes that are happening. So I'm going to talk about a series of studies to keep my eye on the time. The first one will be very briefly talking about oral health. The second will be looking at postpartum depression and infant health. And the third, changes in juvenile foraging behavior. And then I'll talk to you a little bit about my most recent trip to the field. And I'll describe what the beautiful photos were that I had for you in my talk about food and water insecurity. So years ago, a couple of years ago, my colleagues and I always try to put a picture of the research team who collected the data, just so that you can see who is actually out there, boots on the ground. We measured oral health in Hadza living in bush camps, village camps, and in intermediate camps. Whether that meant that they were dividing their time between the two, or whether they were living in kind of these liminal spaces where they had easy access to both the deep bush camps or centers of commerce like a village. They could easily kind of access both of those locations. And we looked at periodontal disease, rates of caries formation, orthodontic disorders, and incidence and frequency of LEH, or linear enamel hypoplasias, which bioarchaeologists use in order to look at nutrition stress. So it's kind of an objective marker of nutrition stress during growth. And just as an aside, one of the reasons I started with this project is I was looking for an objective marker to measure, to figure out if there was a way to determine whether or not people living in the bush versus people living in the village were experiencing different types of nutritional stress or any stress at all. And part of the reason I chose to do oral health is because there is a large pushback in a lot of sectors, particularly among behavioral ecologists and evolutionary anthropologists, who argue that foragers have an ideal diet, are not suffering from malnutrition, are actually quite healthy, and are not suffering from any diseases of so-called civilization. That's a very problematic term, and yet it remains in the literature. So I thought, okay, well, I study nutrition, so what do I have in my toolkit that I can pull out to actually measure what some of these changes might look like and have some quantified data where we can start the conversation / get grant funding to do a project that would use other types of methods to capture what was going on. So I'll give you just the highlights. I don't want to bore you with too many graphs and charts, but I'll give you just the highlights. So one of the take-home messages is that women in the bush were at a significantly lower risk of caries than those living in the village. That's really the most important part. And as a nice kind of internal check, we had found that intermediate was intermediate for every measure that we took, so in terms of caries formation. And what this means, if you look at women versus men in general, we're talking about individuals who are living in the village. So women who are eating more domesticated foods are at highest risk. This is not surprising to bioarchaeologists who have looked at historic populations and fossil populations. The transition to agriculture during the Neolithic was much harder on women, period. In almost every community you find that that's the case. So while it was not surprising to me that we found this result, it was very surprising to our reviewers who were not as familiar with the bioarchaeological literature on how it turns out that the patriarchal system of farming does not go so well for egalitarian forager women. And so the teeth tend to be a bellwether for me. So as a nutritional anthropologist, the teeth tell a story. They tell the story of your life. They tell a story of so many aspects of your growth and development. And they tell an aspect of your health. So women in general were thought to have a more cariogenic oral environment. And so some have argued that this might be due to the oral microbiome, which, spoiler alert, we actually don't know enough about the oral microbiome to make such claims. But for whatever reason, we find that women in these communities have higher rates of caries. So some argue that it's because of hormonal components. Women just have an oral environment that causes us to be more susceptible to cavities. And others argue that the reason women have more cavities is because they're dealing with low-level inflammation and malnutrition, which then leads to things like higher rates of caries formation once they're out of this egalitarian system and into a more hierarchical and patriarchal system whereby they're getting less food, and the food that they are getting is of lower quality. We also ran an interaction effect. We did an interaction effect model for sex by location. So essentially, whether you lived in the bush, whether you lived in an intermediate location, or whether you were in a village. So the high is higher access to the village and higher market integration. And this was estimated marginal means of carries. So what we found is that when we stratified by location, there was a strong sex difference. So what you find, so males are in the blue, essentially men in the bush actually have the worst teeth. Men in the village have the best teeth, and the pattern flipped for women. So women in the bush have the best teeth, and as we've already said, women in the village have the worst teeth. So why? Why do we have this? Well, we have 3 hypotheses. And I am a fan of pleiotropy, so of course I think it could be all of these things combined. I don't have a smoking gun. But one of the reasons we think that women in the bush might have the best teeth are the top 2. So here are some tubers, picture of tubers. Tubers are incredibly fibrous. Hadza women consume more tubers than their male counterparts. We have strong evidence to suggest that, both behavioral evidence and also data from a study, a microbiome study that I did with colleagues several years ago, where we actually show that women have an elevated concentration of bacterial species that are specifically associated with tuber species like this. And so we know that they're eating more of these wild tubers. They're often covered in grit when they pull them out of the ground, so they're getting more abrasion on their teeth. Women in the bush also have better dental hygiene. They brush their teeth more. You are looking over there to the right, you are looking at a picture of a Hadza toothbrush from the plant Salvadora persica. So it is colloquially known as the toothbrush plant. And women in the bush have better oral hygiene, and they brush their teeth more. Maybe because they have dirt in their mouth from eating the tubers. For whatever reason, they brush their teeth more than their male counterparts. The men in the bush are eating more honey than anyone else. So much honey, in fact, that it became really challenging for us when we were trying to take a lot of the oral health measures. And they had comb attached to their teeth, and we had scraped the honeycomb off of their teeth before we could use this dental laser. Yeah, again, didn't think I was going to become a nutritional chemist, did not think that I was going to have a dentist teaching me how to use a pediatric dental laser on Hadza teeth in the bush, but science. So we had to take off some of the honeycomb before we could actually measure any of this. So not only are they consuming the most honey, but they're also smoking more than their female counterparts, both tobacco and marijuana, which they smoke daily. This is a soapstone pipe. They're now also using corncob pipes. So this essentially is the lighter. It's an ember that they're using. And so there has been some data to suggest that the oral microbiome becomes more conducive to caries formation when you are a heavy smoker. But that has yet to be tested among the Hadza. We also looked at incidence and frequency of linear enamel hypoplasias. So what this basically tells us is it tells you, if you look at these lines in teeth, it can tell you about the quality of the diet when you were being weaned. What we found is in the bush, we measured in the bush based on retrospective interviews of where you were living when you were weaned, because all Hadza know where they were living at various stages of their childhood. So when they were in the bush and they had a weaning diet of wild foods, we compared that to individuals who were weaned on domesticates when they lived in the village versus those who were dividing their time between the bush and village, living in these intermediate camps. And what we found during the period of tooth formation, again, it was a really nice kind of internal check, is that there were lower incidences of linear enamel hypoplasias on those who were weaned in the bush, meaning eating bush foods meant that they were by and large healthier, right? So lower markers of stress as that enamel is laid down. In a village, much higher frequencies of linear enamel hypoplasias, and then intermediate weaning diet, you guessed it, they were right in the middle. And you can see that here, proportions of males and females in the bush, in these intermediate camps, and also in these village groups where they were during their toddler years. And we did it with at least one anterior tooth, as we had a bioarchaeologist measure those and score them. So a weaning diet in the bush was consistent with a diet that met the nutrient requirements during tooth formation. And that in the village suggested interruption of enamel secretion, which was likely due to malnutrition. So this is important, right? This study is important because it tells us that your teeth can actually tell a story of your nutrition, right? Of the level of nutrition or malnutrition, as the story may be, during growth and development. So hold that in your mind. As we move to the second study I want to share with you, we're switching gears. So we're going from, again, 1 foot in each, right? So now we're going to talk a little bit about medical anthropology and a little bit about sociocultural anthropology. This project was led by my graduate student, Crittenden, who is a medical anthropologist, and she was really interested in trying to determine whether or not this big period of upheaval and change was impacting women's postpartum mood. She was very interested in kind of how it impacts the birth experience in general. So her dissertation is looking at a very large data set of really comprehensive interviews, looking at birth stories and looking at essentially changes in everything from herbs, traditional herbs that women take when they're pregnant or to end a pregnancy, which we also don't really talk much about in the literature, but so be it, it exists. And all of the changes, these rapid changes that are happening in their community, and how this is impacting these women and their infants. So the very small piece of the study that I'll tell you about right now, she conducted EPDS, so the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale. So she wanted to see whether or not it has been cross-culturally validated. It's been used in adjacent communities to the Hadza, so it's been used and validated in Tanzania. And she wanted to determine whether or not this was, first, whether or not it was an accurate measurement. She was dubious, I'll tell you that, but she said, can't make any a priori assumptions. We're going to go into the field with this tool. We're going to figure it out. So using this tool, she found that 12 out of 23 women were considered at risk of depression, and she used the highest cutoff score that's been used in the cross-cultural literature. So basically, she used the highest measurement to be the most, I guess, restrictive in terms of who got lumped into this category. So she used a very high number. She also did several interviews following work by Oates and colleagues looking at, and I have it listed here, looking at happiness and unhappiness. So this was an additional qualitative interview. And she determined that the language used in the EPDS may have influenced how mothers perceived the questions, which is not something that's typically discussed when you use a diagnostic screener like this cross-culturally. So she followed it up using very comprehensive ethnographic data and determined, she asked women what brings sadness after birth, and she found 3 themes: difficulty breastfeeding, delayed recovery, and infants failing to thrive. And all 3 of these were then tethered in women's narratives to earlier menstruation and earlier age of first birth. The youngest mother in her sample was 9 years old. So if you look at average age of first birth in pretty much every ethnographic account you have of the Hadza, you'll see that the youngest age is about 15 or 16. 9 is much younger. We also see associated changes in weaning. So fewer mothers are feeding their infants colostrum. Many are now using maize flour in lieu of traditional weaning foods, and we already have seen, based on the linear enamel hypoplasia data, what that does in terms of growth outcomes. And we now have a younger infant age of weaning. So needless to say, there's a lot going on. Moms have a lot to say, so these interviews are incredibly rich, and I think Kristen will be working on these transcriptions for a very long time. If you're interested in this paper, it will be out in early view next week in Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry, Postpartum Maternal Mood Among Hadza Foragers of Tanzania, a Mixed Methods Approach. So it'll be coming out next week. Okay, and last but not least, the final study I want to share with you, looking at changes in subadult foraging patterns, so child foraging patterns, children and juveniles from 2005 to 2017. And I use this picture, the 2005 data were collected by this much younger and more spry me, and this is one of my graduate students, Trevor, in 2017. And he had this idea that he wanted to compare data that I had collected as a graduate student with data that he was collecting as a graduate student. So he compared a bunch of different measurements. I'll talk just about a few of them right now. Turns out that a fewer number of overall kids in bush camps are foraging. So in 2005, 86% of children residing in bush camps were foraging for at least 3 days out of the total period of time that we were there. In 2017, 52% of children are foraging. So fewer are foraging, but interestingly, participants in 2017 were significantly more productive based on kilocalories. So what this means is the ones who are foraging are incredibly motivated to do so and remain very productive. We also see very strong sex differences in terms of what males and females are bringing back. So boys are very, very productive now in 2017, more so than they were in 2005, and girls are less productive. And this was perplexing to us, as why we would see these, I guess it wasn't that perplexing to me. I have a hunch as to why we're seeing this reduction in productivity, but I'll get there in a moment. So you can look at proportion of kilocalories foraged by food category. What you're seeing in 2017 is we're pretty much looking at baobab, berries, and a little bit of birds, where it's much more diverse in 2005. So a lot of these foods are not listed now. When you ask the Hadza what they've eaten over the last year, a lot of these food species that we had routinely for the last 100 years of ethnographic data collection are now no longer coming up in food lists. And a young boy, Mustafa, here says, we hunt now to find food to eat with our maize flour. So one of the most well-known attributes of Hadza childhood has always been their economic productivity. And it's been argued that by the end of middle childhood, approximately when you're about 10 years old, that a child can collect up to half of their daily caloric needs. And this was confirmed in 2005 with my data. What you'll find here is that in 2005, and this is from a 2013 paper, sex did not significantly affect distance traveled. Okay, so not only are there sex differences in terms of what kids are bringing back, but also it looked like boys and girls were essentially going the same distance. I'm part of the large cross-cultural project called Spatial Cognition and Navigation, the SCAN project. And right now there are 6 communities around the world, various degrees of market integration. We have small-scale farmers, foragers, pastoralists, urban, peri-urban, rural. In all of these communities, we've looked at distances that kids traveled. And what we found as part of this NSF-funded project, this is just also from 2017, we decided to look at range. And what we found is in 2017, contrary to what we found in 2005, sex does now significantly affect distance traveled. So boys are now not only collecting more, but they're going farther than their female counterparts. And we're currently analyzing the data, but right now what we're seeing in their responses as to why is that there are far more restrictions that are currently being put on girls' mobility as opposed to boys. And this is due to the increased interaction with neighboring groups, with ethno-tour operators, with missionaries. The village life is encroaching onto the bush. So you see that you see the system of, again, this greater kind of patriarchal system in Tanzania where women's mobility is limited. We typically did not see it in this community, but you did with other ethnic groups who lived in the area. It's now starting to manifest not only in interviews, but also in the qualitative and the quantitative data coming out of the community. So how do these changes impact health? Another project done by my student Trevor, we used WHO standards, World Health Organization standards, and looked at weight for age, height for age, and weight for height, and we compared the data from the 2 years, and bush living versus village living children, because we had both. We used the traditional WHO, green for normal, gold for mild, and red or black for moderate or severe malnutrition. And don't worry too much about the cross-tabulation analyses. I have them covered in green. The most important thing. So we essentially looked, you can see the year right there, so 2005 versus 2017 on the left. On the right, you'll see that I also divided it up by residence location. So we did bush versus village, both in 2005 and 2017. So essentially, like the ratio tests for all of these tables are shown, in 2005, kids who were eating a mixed diet, so kids who were eating both bush foods and village foods, exhibited less stunting and wasting than the kids in 2005 who were eating only a bush diet. In 2017, all individuals exhibited overall less stunting and wasting than in 2005. So what does this mean? Because this is very, very early nutrition transition. We're kind of looking at the first snapshot where we can actually get quantified data on a combined mixed diet. So what do they mean? Well, we don't actually know, but I have some ideas. One, that changes in diet are evident and can be measured, so looking at things like oral health. So all of these studies combined, what do they tell us? Moms are reporting changes in things like age at first birth and infant weaning practices that are likely tethered to changes in diet. Children and juveniles might be healthy right now, and I stress early transition eating a mixed diet of wild foods and agricultural products, because we know that while this secular trend may be appearing in the data right now, We know what happens when foragers transition into a diet of agricultural products. History is repeating itself. The outcomes are not good. So we know what will happen 10, 15, 20 years down the line. Right now, the population size is fairly small, and we're very early in this transition. So we, down the road, hopefully we're planning to look at changes in cardiometabolic health associated with this transition. More data are needed, of course, and much better repeated measures. What this tells you is that we are in a very interesting time period where a lot of changes are happening. I had a lot of beautiful photos to show you, and none of them made it. So I'm going to tell you, I don't want it to be all doom and gloom. So of course, it's all doom and gloom, because all of my happy, uplifting photos didn't make it. So I will tell you about the happy, uplifting photos. I just came back from the field about a month ago, and I started a project where Hadza community members are acting as data collectors. And they have been involved from the beginning, from the outset. Before I ever wrote the grant, before I ever went out into the field, we started with grounded theory. So I went out to the field and we talked about what they wanted studied and how these changes were impacting their community and how we could measure the rate and kind of the pace of that change and its impact. So we are now working on a multi-pronged project that is looking at food and water insecurity, diet composition, hydration strategies, basically who's collecting water, where is the water, how much of the water are you getting. We've started baseline water quality tests. So I also figured out how to be a environmental engineer and microbiologist this summer. I set up a lab in the back of my Land Rover, and we did water quality testing for water from every watering source in Hadza land. So in all the bush camps, there were about 140 people currently living in bush camps in the highlands. And those 140 Hadza individuals were all using the same 4 watering sources. In addition to those 140 Hadza individuals, there were 3 Datoga, who were neighboring pastoralists, bomas. Each one of those bomas together, so combined, there were about roughly 100 Datoga. So now we're at 240, using those same 4 watering sources. And cattle. The Datoga pastoralists know exactly how many cattle they have. They're the mobile bank accounts. They know down to the last goat, the last cow, and we estimated based on all of these self-reports of these pastoralists that there are about 800 cows and goats also using those same watering sources. The Datoga report that each cow drinks approximately 40 liters of water a day. So like a fool, I decided to double check a pastoralist on their own math. Yeah, turns out they know exactly how much cows drink, right? They know exactly how much their cattle are drinking, and it turns out that that estimate of 40 liters is fairly accurate based on a lot of the animal science literature. It's a lot of souls drinking out of very few watering holes. So no surprise, it turns out that the Hadza are very water insecure right now. But interestingly enough, it seems, and these are only our preliminary results because we're just analyzing the data right now, it seems that life's about trade-offs, right? We all knew that. But that there's a trade-off right now. Individuals who are choosing to live very close to water sources are very food insecure and less water insecure. Individuals who are choosing to live closer to bush foods, closer to more sustained access to wild foods, they are less food insecure and far more water insecure. There are a lot of really interesting initiatives happening in the community. The village camps now have access to a very large water tank. So there is a Hadza camp on the outskirts of the village that is literally in a town called Mongola on top of a huge watering tank, which is great. But it also means that everyone else in the community is also using that watering tank. So in the morning, you can see all of the bicycle tracks, all of the motorcycle tracks. People are coming in from all around the village in order to access this water. It is really clean. It turns out the water there in the village is much cleaner than the water in the bush because the cattle can't drink directly out of the water tank. So it's a really interesting story and one that we're going to continue to collect data on. I wish I had more photos, but I will leave with one more kind of uplifting story. Because many people in this room have contributed to this tale I'm about to tell you. A Hadza friend of mine named Shawnee is currently in the United States, getting his master's degree in Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And Shawnee is the first Hadza to come to the US. There was rumors that there was a Hadza person in Canada. Those rumors have turned out to be false. No Hadza identified this supposed Hadza who was in Canada, so everybody says, nope, Shawnee's the first one. So Shawnee is getting his master's degree. We flew over together in August and took a trip to Tucson, and then I went on home to Las Vegas. And Shawnee will be the first member of his community to ever earn a secondary degree. He's one of only 4, we think, 4 or 5, who have ever made it to university. We think only one other person has ever graduated university, and he's one of only a dozen who ever finished primary school. So Shawnee is working very hard on behalf of his community, and he's here through a GoFundMe site that many people in this room contributed to. So Shawnee is doing well, and if you wait after, I can pull up some photos and I can show you about his exciting life in the US. He was just in Los Angeles over the weekend. He was in Las Vegas visiting me the weekend before that. And it was a very interesting experience for my husband and my 6-year-old. The first Hadza member that they met came and stayed with us at our house. So that was a very powerful experience, I think, for all of us, including Shawnee. And he was texting a lot of Hadza with cell phones, and he's like, I'm in Alyssa's house, her real house. So, you know, the scientist becomes the subject because he was very interested in all the weird stuff going on in my house. He had a lot of questions. So I found myself explaining my cultural biases to a Hadza person. And it was a very life-altering experience, and I'm sure it will continue to be so. I would like to end now and thank all of my collaborators. There are many, and all of my funders. There are many, and of course, thank the Hadza for their patience, their hospitality, and their collaboration. And I think we have time for some questions.